So I don't know how many of you caught it a couple weeks ago, but a new phobia kind of hit the social media circuit and online journals, and that was the new phobia of fecundity. Molly Hemingway, writing for the Federalist late last month, described fecundophobia as the growing fear of children and fertile women, and cited ample evidence about this growing disinclination toward children, childbearing women, and especially big families. And I'm sure many of you have run into this in various manifestations, and especially the contention that fecundity is putting the world at risk because we're already overpopulated, this belief that we're already overpopulated and that our resources are limited. Well, our speaker today confronts this idea and describes the reality of what to expect when no one's expecting. Jonathan Last is a senior writer at the Weekly Standard, a Washington-based political magazine, and author of What to Expect When No One's Expecting, America's Coming Demographic Disaster. His writings have been featured in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the Claremont Review of Books, First Things, and elsewhere. I know that this topic is very close to the hearts of many of us, including those on the LFN staff, and we're very excited to have Mr. Last with us today. So please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you. So when Catherine this morning was talking about being on the commuter train with the little baby and people saying, how many kids do you have? And 3. So this is totally true. The fecundophobia is absolutely true, but it has been accompanied by this weird zoophilia where people are insane for pets now. So I first noticed this when we were living, before we had our 3 bundles of joy. Before we had them, we were living in this little close-in suburb of Washington, D.C., and we had 6 gourmet doggy bakery/spas and 2 places that sold children's clothing. And so I thought this was a little weird, and I started looking around when I wrote the book, and it's crazy. So the people down where I live, you want to go away to Paris for the weekend, you board your dog at this place called Dogtown, USA, where every dog gets their very own house. And inside the house is furnished with tile backsplashes, and there are paintings on the wall. Every doggy house has a real person bed in it, and a television, and air conditioning. It's really crazy. And it's even worse than that. We've changed a state law so that you can now set up trust funds for dogs. We have, there's healthcare insurance and car insurance that includes dogs. And so we had the best of all this was we had this big fight in Washington, D.C., this neighborhood called Lincoln Park out on Capitol Hill. And so Lincoln Park is one of these out by the Capitol, sort of slowly gentrifying. And so the Dinks moved in first, and they moved in with their dogs. And then about 4 or 5 years later, a couple people moved in who had 1 kid each. And so the dog owners had taken over the little square at the center of this neighborhood, and that was their dog run. And the people came in with their kids, and the dogs and the kids were getting into conflicts, and people were getting bitten. It's the Washington Post goes out to cover this because it's this big, big fight. And one of the dog owners says to the Post reporter, she says, look, I don't mind children. Children are fine and everything, but what we need is a small fenced off part of the park where you could put the children so they don't bother the dogs. This is exactly backwards. Now, the truth is, I don't actually care much for dogs myself. I'm not a dog person. But I think even if you took somebody who really loved dogs from 1965 and you brought them into modern America, they would say this is insane. And so I found 2 weeks ago, I find this. This is not from The Onion. So this is the Yaff bar. This is the first power bar for people to share with their dogs. So you go for a hike with Mr. Darcy, and you stop to you pull out your thing of smart water, and you, hey buddy, want to have a Yaff bar? It's crazy, and I would say I don't want to call it a sickness. Dogs are great. I'm sure I'll get a dog someday. But it's a sickness, and it's just one little side tributary of the larger thing about population and about children. And it's really all about how we've changed the view we have of children in our lives. So you guys, I don't know how much you have thought about this, but in the conventional wisdom, everything we know about population and demographics is wrong. It all comes from this 1968 book called The Population Bomb. It's written by this guy, Paul Ehrlich. So I hate this guy, and not just because his book sold 3 million copies. So he starts the population bomb by saying, in just a few years, hundreds of millions of people are going to starve to death no matter what we do. There's nothing we can do to stop this. The coming population crash is upon us. It's because our fertility rates are so high. We are sending our population increasing asymptotically to the moon. And that's wrong. He winds up being totally wrong. But what's interesting about his book is that he's wrong at the moment when the precise opposite is happening. So in 1968, the fertility rates in the Western industrialized worlds fall off the table. And so today we are actually looking by all estimates at population contraction. Did I fast forward past? Yeah, so this is what we're looking at. This is the UN projection for the next 50 years or so. And so what they think is we're going to be peaking global population somewhere around 9 billion or so, give or take, and then begin shrinking. And the question, all the real uncertainty is, out here, once we get past 2050 or so, how fast and how far do we shrink? And we don't know that because we don't know how far the fertility rate is actually going to fall. So when I say fertility rate, do you guys know what I'm talking about? The total fertility rate is the average number of children that the average woman in a society has over the course of her lifetime. So in order for you to have a stable population, your fertility rate has to be 2.1. If you're above that, your population grows. If you're below that, population shrinks. Here in America, we went underneath the 2.1 mark in 1973. We have been below it ever since. We've touched it. We've touched 2.1 twice between now since then. But so what happened in demographics, as Paul Ehrlich was writing his really stupid book, was that everybody who actually studied demographics, because Ehrlich was not a demographer, he studied butterflies. He's an entomologist, and so what he was doing was, his cardinal sin was he was just applying the population dynamics of butterfly colonies to people, and it doesn't really work that way for complicated reasons. So as Ehrlich is writing his book, the whole West goes below the replacement rate, and for 10 or 15 years, everybody who actually takes demographics seriously is looking and trying to figure out what is it about liberalism that's causing people to not have enough babies to be at the replacement level. But then in the 1980s, they sort of look up and look around, and it turns out it's not just the first world anymore. It's everywhere. It's all across the developing world, all across Africa, the Middle East, South America, Asia, to the point where right now 97% of the world, 90% of the world population lives in a country where the fertility rate is falling. And we've gone from, when was it, 1979, the global fertility rate was 6. So the average woman in the world had 6 kids. Today it's 2.5. That's 34 years? I'm not supposed to do math on stage. So it's like a little bit less than 2 generations. It's more than a 50% drop. It's really, really interesting. And we don't know how far it's going to go. And that's where all the big uncertainty winds up out there. So when we look at America, our fertility rate right now is about 1.93. And the truth is that's pretty good. It is just about tops among first world countries, depending on the accounting method that they're using. The French might be a little bit higher. So 1.93 ain't bad. And if we thought that 1.93 was sustainable into the future, then we would actually be okay. I wouldn't have bothered writing the book. I would have said, hey, we got a lot of immigration, we'll be okay. But a lot of the guys who study this think that 1.93 is actually not sustainable for this reason. So let me break this out into cohorts here. The US middle class has 1.6. Now, I'm sort of very grossly defining US middle class here as white women who have graduated from college. So this is slightly distortion, I'm abstracting here, and you just bear with me. Why do we care about the middle class? We care about the middle class because in all of the surveys of this, it turns out that fertility is an aspirational behavior, which is to say that the people who have less income and less education model their fertility behaviors on the people with more income and more education. You see this going back all societies 300, 400, 500 years. Some great research by this Austrian guy, Vergard Skirbeck, if you're interested in it. So the reason you care about the middle class is because the middle class is leading the aspirational behavior of everybody else. Our 1.93, which looks pretty good, is because we have huge numbers of Hispanic immigrants over the last 35 years who've come here with very, very high fertility rates, which is great, except that what we've seen already from those folks is that they're regressing to the mean. And so they're following the middle class and cutting back on their fertility. And we're so dependent on immigration and Hispanic fertility that if they don't hold their rates, and it looks like they're not going to, then our overall number is going to keep going down. So this is why we care about this. And let me just put into it's a real stark relief how low 1.6 really is. You guys all know about China's one-child policy, right? So really repressive, really terrible. But also, it's not literally one child, right? Like if you go and you bribe the party official or you live in a certain province, you might be able to have two. So their actual fertility rate in China is 1.54. Look at that, so we have 6/100ths of a kid more than the poor women in China in the middle class. And I think that tells you something real evocative about how we regard children here. So the question then, moving quickly, because like I said, I think I've told you, I want to talk for about 35, maybe 40 minutes, and then just sort of open it up so we can have questions and a conversation about it, because I think that's normally pretty fruitful. So why do we care? Why is it bad if population contracts? Because if you just think about it quickly, it's not obvious that that's a bad thing, right? I mean, there's a lot of people we could maybe do with a few less. I drove up here in traffic yesterday along 95. I would not mind losing about 50 million people. So the reason we care is because it's math here again. You don't just lose people, because before you get to lose people, the age structure of your population changes. So Japan is really the canary in the coal mine. Japan is like the leading edge of population decline. They're actually already losing people year over year. And so let me tell you, this is what we call the age charts. So these are boys in blue, girls in pink, and we're in 5-year cohorts going up. And so you're just seeing the longer the bars are, the bigger the cohorts are, right? So this is Japan in 2000. And you can already see what declining fertility looks like. Here's where they went 50 years ago, sub-replacement, and then each succeeding generation gets a little bit smaller. So here's Japan today, and here's Japan in 2050. And so this is why we care, because this is a disaster. This is really problematic. It's problematic in any society, but particularly in Western societies where we've propped up all sorts of entitlement programs, which are predicated on paying out pensions and health care to the elderly. Where does that money come from? What does it do to an economy? It's really problematic. So here we are in America. This is 1980. So this is shortly, again, you can see, so this is 1980, right? 1973, roughly, give or take, go back 10 years, which is where we went sub-replacement. So things start getting smaller. So here's where we are today. I mentioned immigration. Here's where we have been saved by immigration. So if you were to go in and just lop off, this oval and that oval, those are the numbers we've had added to us over the last 35 years through immigration. And you can see our shape, the shape of the curve there, would look much more like Japan's without immigration. But this is then what we're looking at it by 2035. And this is roughly what the age plot of Florida looks like today. So, by 2035, the whole country is like Florida. We're geezer nation. And that causes a bunch of problems, right? You can think about all these problems on your own. You'd come to you if you just spent 5 minutes thinking about it. But like Social Security, right? We've got this big entitlement state. When we stood up Social Security, we had 16 or so workers for every retiree. It settled around 1960 or so. I think around 6 workers per retiree. Right now, we're at about 3. We're going to go down to 2 in the next 15 or 20 years. Now that doesn't sound so bad, right? You say, 3 to 2. But what that means is that if you're going to hold your benefits constant, that you have to increase the tax burden 50% on each of those 2 remaining workers. That's really problematic. And what it really means is that someone's going to get screwed, right? I mean, either we're not going to keep our promises to the old folks that we've told, hey, you're going to get your Social Security money, plan your lives accordingly, or we're going to radically increase the tax burden on the people who are still working. You wind up having all sorts of really problematic macroeconomic stuff going on when you have a very old population. This is Japan. All right, so what we're looking at here in Japan is nominal growth. Those are our bars going up like this, plotted against the proportion of people younger than 65. So as you wind up getting older and older and older, you see how growth starts shrinking. Again, this is going to be obvious to you if you think about it for like 5 seconds. So first world economies tend to be what are called innovation-based economies, which are largely based on technological progress and advancement. Where does most of that come from? It comes from people who are between the ages of 20 and 40, historically. So as that band of people, 20 to 40, shrinks, they're just going to have less innovation. Think about capital, right? Capital is really important for an economy. What do young people do with their capital? They invest it very aggressively. They have long time horizons. They're very risk tolerant. What do older people do? Older people have to really husband their capital because they are not risk tolerant at all, or they're drawing their capital down, pulling it out of the market to spend on vacations to Florida and stuff. So all of this is why you wind up seeing economies slow down as countries wind up getting older. This is another measure, another thing that happens, you wind up with skyrocketing public debt. And so we're looking at here is public debt plotted against the percentage of people over 65. Totally obvious. Now, you guys are too young to remember this, but like back in 1980, Japan was taking over the world. Like, every year, like clockwork, Newsweek and Time would run cover stories about how by the year 2000, everyone in America would have to learn to speak Japanese if they wanted to have a job. Japanese investors had bought up like half the real estate in Manhattan. We had like these weird xenophobic movies like Gung Ho about like American auto workers being put out of work by these like, nasty robotic Japanese managers. So in the middle of all this, like as Japan was at its economic height, demographers in Japan were looking at their fertility rate, looking at their age structure, and they were like waving white flags, doing semaphores saying, hold on, we got problems here. We are not going to be able to sustain this economic advance because of our old people. Nobody listened to them. Right? So in 1991, Japan hits a recession. They initially call it the lost decade. We're now in year 23 of Japan's lost decade. And it is generally accepted over there that what we are in is a demographic-based recession. And that's what it looks like. And this is why we care about this stuff. And I would say, whatever, I don't want to be too hyperbolic here, because in a first world country like America, we could probably, it's not going to be Mad Max with old people, right? I mean, it's not going to be Thunderdome. We're not going to have to walking through Walmart, beating up old people to get the last box of Cheerios or something. But on the other hand, it's easy to see how when you're in a situation like this, you really seed the ground for generational conflict. God bless him, 2 weeks before my book came out, Japan's finance minister holds a press conference where he says that it is time for the country's old people to, quote, hurry up and die. He doesn't lose his job. I mean, imagine if the Secretary of the Treasury of the United States was caught on a hot mic saying, geez, we gotta get rid of these old people. It would be terrible. But over there, this is a real thought because they have these problems. And I think, a society does itself no favors. Even if we're not heading to Mad Max, we do ourselves no favors by not paying attention to this stuff and not thinking about what the actual consequences are. So the question then becomes, how do we get here? How do we get to this place where nobody has babies? And that's a complicated answer, as it turns out. I wrote a whole book about it. It's a huge constellation of factors. And again, if you think about this for 5 minutes on your own, you'll come up with it yourself. You don't need me. The decline of infant mortality, right? Probably the single biggest driver in the decline of fertility. If you don't have to have 12 kids anymore to keep 4 of them alive, like you had to do 200 years ago. So this is a good thing. Some of these changes are very good. The increase of education. Now, I think you could make an argument that we've gone slightly crazy with education in America today. But as a historical matter, over the last 200 years, the increase in education, totally good thing. But at the same time, there are no free lunches. And we've seen, again, in all places at all times, increases in education drive down fertility. The more education people have, the fewer kids they have. So this is why I'm saying it's a big constellation of factors. Some of them are good, some of them are bad. A bad one, for instance, so just to be something non-judgmental, even our liberal friends would agree with this, middle-class wage stagnation. Since 1972, middle-class wages in America basically flat. So after really robust growth following the war for really a generation and a half, since then, almost nothing. That's really hard. It makes it hard for people to have kids. What else? Well, college, right? So as recently as 1984, 30% of high school seniors started college within 4 years of graduating. Today, it's upwards of 70%. That's a lot. And at the same time, the real costs of college have increased by over 1,000% in real dollars, which is, I don't have to tell you, but because your parents are doing this right now, that's real money, right? And so this affects us in a couple of ways, one of which is, as prospective parents looking down the barrel of having kids, we think, geez, that costs a lot of money. I don't think I want to do that. But in another, slightly less obvious way, you come out of school carrying a lot of debt. A lot of surveys from Fannie and Freddie show people coming out of school with a lot of debt say, I'm going to postpone marriage because of my college debt, and also I'm going to postpone having children because of my college debt. And this then winds up shrinking our window. I mean, so this is the timing of marriage. We talked about this, or what do you call it? The success sequence, right? The success sequence, if once it involves college and big, fancy, expensive colleges, if you feel like you have to get that paid off or get into paying that off, it just shortens your reproductive window, right? Because biology turns out to be pretty immutable. Once after 39, it becomes hard to have kids. So these are some of the big macro causes, but there are really just thousands of them. And for our purposes, I would say in the realm of the cultural, there's something I would focus on, which is sex, oddly enough, which has something to do with having kids. So if you go back 2 generations, we had basically this iron triangle governing marriage, sex, and kids, right? And it went something like this, basically. You had to get married to have sex. You couldn't have sex without having kids, and you wouldn't have kids without getting married, right? And this was basically true for everybody, not always and everywhere true. There are complications to this story. So for instance, actually there's some interesting research looking at sexual behavior of middle-class women in the early 1960s. So the early 1960s really were the 50s if you watch Mad Men. And it found that an enormously high percentage of women, relative to what we think, had premarital sex before they got married in the early 1960s. But what they were doing is actually kind of interesting, because they were having sex 4 to 6 weeks or 2 to 6 weeks before the marriage with the guy that they were eventually going to get married to. So what they were having was literally premarital sex, whereas today, premarital sex barely exists. Two kids who do it behind the football stadium, at the homecoming dance. That's not premarital in any reasonable sense of the word, because neither of them has any idea about getting married to one another. So anyway, so we've got this iron triangle, right, where you got to get married to have sex, can't have sex without having a baby, you don't have a baby out of wedlock. And then beginning in basically 1968, right, as our fertility rate falls off the table, you have these 3 changes which really break that iron triangle apart, right? We have the birth control pill, which we talked earlier, so which all of a sudden really says you can have sex whenever you want. We have what is called contraceptive mastery now, and it really divorces sex from baby making. You have then the divorce culture and the combination of the divorce culture emerging and cohabitation emerging. And this now says that you can get together without being married. And then you have the rise of illegitimacy, which you also talked about earlier today. And so normally I say, guess what percentage of births are illegitimate? You guys know this now. 43% last year of all births were illegitimate. 48% of first births were to unwed mothers. And so this just breaks apart that old iron triangle, and it has the perverse effect of pushing average age of sexual initiation, as the sociologists call it, all the way down here, way back to 16, 17, and then pushing average age of first marriage all the way out here to 27, 28. And so we create this giant disconnect between these 2 fundamental things, all because of the culture and what's been going on. And so it's really problematic. Now, when the people who study this demographic change stuff look at it, there are 2 camps. There are two schools of thought. And the one is what I just explained to you, basically all of this, and it's called the causal method. And so that is the sort of the very traditional econometric view of the world, which is you have a thing, it is being influenced by 1,000 different outputs, or 1,000 different inputs. And so if we want to change the outcome, all we have to do is tinker with the inputs and get good tax policy or change divorce law or something like that. And the truth is that's kind of a comforting worldview. I actually like that worldview. It's nice because it says to you, okay, well, we could fix this. We could do something about this if we really put our mind to it. But there's another model that was put out in the late 1990s by a pair of European demographers, Ron Lestegi and Dirk van de Ka. And theirs is more of like a grand unified theory of what's going on in fertility decline. They call it the second demographic transition. And what they postulate is that all of this stuff, all of these changes are really centered around the act of having babies. And that the reason we're not having babies anymore is because we have fundamentally changed our conception of the self. We have changed how we view ourselves and our place in the world, so that we are no longer linked to tribalism. We're no longer even linked to sort of the smaller tribalism of the family. Now we are purely in service of the self. And so the entire way in which we interact with the world, from marriage to having kids to getting divorced, we don't have any bindings on that anymore. There are no ties to that. All we have is ourselves at the center, and we follow our bliss. And so to the extent that anybody in this worldview has a kid, it's an act of self-actualization. Right, it's just something they do because they want to do it. It's not because they're doing it, as part of a union or a marriage or because they're doing it for any sort of larger duties. And I would say it's pretty persuasive, because if you think about what's going on in fertility decline, you think about, okay, so why is the same fertility decline happening in Iran, in Brazil, in Sweden, in Canada, in Japan, in Singapore? Like, what do these countries all have in common? The answer is not a whole lot. I mean, it really could be that there's something about modernity itself, that there's something in the water that's pushing us all in this way. And this is a problem because we need babies. We need to have them. The problem is that babies kind of suck. And so I will proceed to explain to you the root of that second demographic transition case. Is basically, I'll make the case against children for you. So, behold, despair all ye who enter the minivan. So children do kind of suck. They're incredibly expensive. When you sort of go and you add up all the math and you do like the actual cost of like, vitamins and Tickle Me Elmo and cribs and strollers, and then you lop on top of that college, and then you lop on top of that opportunity cost of wages for a spouse who stays home part of the time. The number winds up being about 1.1 million, Dr. Evil, $1.1 million per kid. That's a lot of money. The average house in America costs $189,000. So how many kids, it's like you're buying 6 houses all at once, but you can't sell them. And like 16 years into it, like, your daughter runs up to her room and slams the door and she goes, "And I hate you!" Like, who does this? It's crazy. I mean, the truth is, if what you want, like a really great financial strategy, a way to get ahead in the world, is to work hard, don't have kids. Like that is really excellent financial planning advice. And you can see, I mean, if you're not spending $1.1 million on your bundle of joy, this is a way to go and get a lot of money in the bank, make some real estate investments, do well. Think about Social Security. Think about those weird incentives that Social Security sets up. Because one of the reasons we used to have kids was so that when you got old and sick and drooling, that your kids would take care of you, right? Well, Social Security is like a competing set of benefits where the government comes in and says, "Don't worry, we'll take care of you. Whether or not you have kids, the government will do for you what kids have traditionally done for people." And so, you don't even have to have kids for that. And kids make you less happy, too. This is another dirty little secret. There's been like 40 years of research on parental happiness. And in 40 years of research, there is one contrary study. all the other data on this goes the other way. And it is this. If you take two people who are demographically identical, right, same race, same income, same religion, same geographic area, same education rates, but one has a kid, one does not, the parent is going to be 6 percentage points less happy than the non-parent, and that's just for the first kid. You lose another 2. So like I'm down, 10 points, like just standing here in front of you. I don't even want to think about Catherine from this morning with her 7. God bless her. So this is, kids are really, it's tough. Like it is a tough road to hoe. And yet, like the really remarkable thing in all this is that people still want them. Like if all you were to go by, like if you guys are like college students, so you don't have time to do this, but if all you ever did was read the New York Times Sunday magazine or like page through the Atlantic Monthly, you would think that no one in America wants or has kids anymore, or that the only people who are like, gay couples and like, Taiwanese billionaires and stuff, right? You think that they're the only ones who still want kids and nobody else would subscribe to that patriarchal claptrap. But it's not true, actually. This is sort of remarkably interesting. So, so marriage is on decline, right? Marriage rates are down precipitously. What are they down to? 90% of Americans still get married at some point in their lives. 90%. That's a lot. People aren't getting, 9 out of 10 Americans aren't getting married because they want their marriages to fail or because they're kind of wishy-washy about it. They really want to get married. They're just not getting there. Demographers measure what's called ideal fertility. And that is you ask people, what is the ideal number of kids? And this is, well, they're too shy. I've just tipped my hand. There are 2 shocking things about ideal fertility. The first is this. If I were to ask you, just by show of hands, which gender you think has a higher ideal fertility number, men or women, who would think women? Right, and who would think men? You're both wrong. This shocked me when I found it out. They're the same. Men and women have essentially the same notions of ideal fertility. They're tiny variations, but very, very tiny variations. They want the same number of kids, basically. But more shocking is that despite everything you've heard, for 40 years, so going back to 70, our ideal fertility rate in America is remarkably stable, right? So like 2.69 back in 70, 2.43 now. That's an incredibly small variance in 2 generations, despite everything we're told. People still want to have kids. And so the real story in this, the story about what's going on here in America, at least with our fertility rate, is why aren't people getting there? What is this big, big chasm between ideal fertility and achieved fertility? You know, it's like a half kid plus. And so I think that that's actually that's a helpful and encouraging thing for America as we look at all this stuff, because we are not in the position of needing to like beat people over the head and tell them, you've got to have kids, you're a bad person if you don't have kids. There is actually a small subset of Americans, it's about 8% of men and women who say they don't want any kids. And it turns out we're fine, even with them not wanting any kids. We don't need to argue them into having kids. All we need to do is help the people who already want kids to get there. That's all. So that's the good news. The bad news is that governments have been trying to do just that for like 2,000 years, and they've never been successful once. So there's that. So the first known attempt at pronatalist policy goes back to Caesar Augustus. He passed a bachelor tax to get unmarried men married. That didn't work. Joseph Stalin needed more babies, and so he created the motherhood medal for women who had 5 or 6 children. You can buy these on eBay for $12. Every Christmas time, like I get this close to buying one for my wife and like dropping it into her stocking, and I never do it. And I don't want to spoil the surprise for you guys. But one of the tough breaks about marriage is that you don't get credit for the bad ideas you don't act on. I was as disappointed as anyone. So Stalin creates these motherhood medals. They don't work. There's in general, I'm going to be just sort of very crudely reductive here, and we can talk about this more in the Q&A if you want to. But to be crudely reductive, there are 2 schools of thought on pronatalist policy, and there's the sort of the liberal school and the conservative school. Now the liberal school basically says, what we need is more daycare. You need to use the engine of the state to liberate mothers to go to work. And they point to the relative success of the Scandinavian countries and France. For complicated reasons I won't get into, the evidence suggests that the liberal school doesn't really work. So for instance, the Scandinavian countries where it is successful, the fertility rate is about 1.7. So that's very moderate success. In France, fertility rate right now just around 2, but that seems to be due almost entirely to immigration. Their immigrant population has fertility rate of about 2.9. Their native-born population of fertility rate, again, about 1.7. So it's not clear that daycare is what's getting it done over there. The conservative school, and again, please understand, I'm just being reductive for the purposes of our talk here, is basically we've got to use market incentives. You've got to have tax credits or tax breaks. Senator Mike Lee from Utah has just put out a whole like family reform agenda to try to give tax breaks to parents. And this is sort of the ne plus ultra for this is Singapore. So Singapore is like what pronatalist policy would look like if I were king for a day. So in Singapore, you got a baby, the government just hands you a check for $9,000. You got another baby, hands you a check for $18,000. Preferential admission to private schools. Housing is largely government run in Singapore, and so if you have a 3rd kid, they will make sure that the grandparents get to move near you so you can fob the kids off on them for childcare, which is like the dream. And they have these 401k accounts for childcare expenses. So like you put $1 in, the government puts in $1, and you like do that all year long, and you use that money to like pay for diapers and like mashed up peas and stuff. Like this is awesome, right? And on top of that, they have like really social conservative policy. They haven't like done away with abortion, but they have like big public campaigns against it, public campaigns run by the government. They require women to go to counseling before they're going to have an abortion. They 2 prime ministers in a row who've like come out and given like these big impassioned speeches against single motherhood and in favor of early marriage and all this stuff. I mean, so basically the guys in Singapore make Rick Santorum look like a dirty hippie, right? and they even do they even do these slightly ridiculous things. They have these national nights, like these big baby making parties. It's like sponsored by Mentos, the fresh maker. And so, they put out like a CD to go with National Night, where you just like take the CD home, and it's like whatever the Singapore version of Barry White is. Anyway, and so what's the result of all of this? The result is that Singapore has gone from a fertility rate of 1.4 to 1.1. So the conservative stuff is a failure too. Like liberal school stuff doesn't work, the conservative school doesn't work either. Now, because the liberal and the conservative school stuff don't work, people try some wacky stuff, like really, really wacky stuff. And so in Japan, like our Japanese friends, what are they going to think the solution is? Robots. so they create this robot. He's called Yotaro. He's like the creepiest ass thing you've ever seen, right? And so his skin is made of silicone, and he responds to sound, and he cries little tears. And the idea of Yotaro is you bring young married couples over to the little creepy robot, and they go, oh, let's get a meat space version of our own. It's crazy, and it hasn't worked, not surprisingly. And so in Russia, they have these things called love benches, and so you walk through Moscow, they're in parks all over the place, and you notice they're intentionally short benches that are intentionally sloped inwards. So you sit down for a walk in the park and, hey, honey, we're canoodling and stuff. And they started this holiday, Family Contact Day. And so everybody gets off and you go home and you make boomsa for the motherland. And then 9 months later, you have Give Birth to a Patriot Day. And if you have a baby on Give Birth to a Patriot Day, you win fabulous prizes. So you walk out of the hospital when they discharge you with a blender or a toaster or something. The grand prize, I'm not kidding, hand to God, this is true. Grand prize was an SUV a couple years ago. And it hasn't worked. It hasn't worked in Russia either. They've had a slight uptick in their birth rate, but their fertility rate has stayed constant. It's complicated math, and I'm not going to embarrass myself by trying to do it in front of you. So the answer to all this, what I'm trying to impress upon you is that people all over the world think that this is a very serious problem. There's both serious and non-serious policy attempts to try to remedy it, to try to bring the fertility rate up, get people to having kids so that our economics are sustainable, so that our social welfare programs are sustainable, and we're going to have to do that too. Now, I would not personally tell any of you to have kids because I don't want that on my head. Whatever you do with kids is between you and your God. But at least some of you are going to have to, or else we're going to turn into Germany. So things are really, really bad in Germany. Germany is losing, I think about 300,000 people a year right now. They're slated to lose 35% of their population over the next 30 years or so. Really, really bad over there. And so you already see these effects in German life, right? So if you go to graduate school for urban planning now in Germany, you're no longer learning how to build things, you're learning how to demolish things. Their urban planning field is now mostly wrapped up in how to go into a city which has too much real estate, too many houses, too many buildings that aren't in use, how to tear them down and create green space that actually holds the integrity of the city core. This is a little scary, especially in the east. They have wolves, they have a wolf problem now. For the first time in 400 years, they have packs of wolves around places that were formerly populated enough to keep the little wolvies out in the forests, but they just don't have enough people anymore. They don't have enough people anymore, and so the state of Westphalia. I mentioned a little bit, the labor market distortions, our aging population, shrinking population is a cause. So in the state of Westphalia, they had these two labor problems. The first is because their cohorts of young men were shrinking. They had all these underemployed prostitutes, so prostitutes without enough work. And they'd have all these old guys, not enough elder care nurses. The Germans are very logical. Too many prostitutes, not enough nurses. Problem solved. And so they started this state-run program to take hookers and train them up into elder care nurses. And so the woman who pilots this, she said, no, again, this is all true. She says to the British Medical Journal when they look into this, she says, well, they have good people skills, they aren't easily disgusted, and they have zero fear of physical contact. So they're perfect. So maybe the lesson of this is that there are some people for whom the falling fertility stuff is going to work out fine, like old German men. But anyway, so we should wrap this up. We can actually have a conversation. But I would say, again, I'm not telling you to have kids, but somebody's going to have to. You should think about it. Do it for yourselves. Do it for America. Or just do it to keep your parents from moving to Dusseldorf. So anyway, thanks a lot, and I'm happy to take questions if you have any.
Okay. So I know a lot of people who believe in overcrowding of the earth and think that the whole demographic winter thing is a myth. And I don't think they're still buying into the 1968 book. And they'll probably move past that. But what is the case that's being made that they're buying into? What evidence is there to make people not believe in demographic winter?
No, they're still buying into the 1968 book. So Paul Ehrlich wrote in the mid-90s like a follow-up book. Like after it's clear that like everything's been, so he writes the population disaster now more than, it's like, now more than ever, we've got to worry about this stuff. I would say the flat earth stuff is remarkable in how durable it is. But what's funny about this is that, so this comes largely from like the political left, right? So where you hear this stuff is you hear from like radical environmentalists and just people, again, I'm going to grossly generalize, but people who are mostly on the left. If you go into the world of professional like academic demographers, all of whom are total lefties, right? I mean, these are people who all voted for Barack Obama with a song in their hearts, and they believe in like the entire, liberal project. They think this stuff is crazy because they actually study demographics and they see where we're going. So I would say, so if you want to make like the handy case, like you want to talk about this with somebody. So the shorthand version of this is, so we've been hearing about overcrowding for 200 years, right? This dates back to Thomas Malthus. Where is it? Like, where are the ill effects? And when you push these folks hard enough, eventually it turns out it's just like a matter of faith for them. Like, empirically, it's just like empirically, let's look at, so from 1900 to 2000, right? In 1900, world population is like 1.8 billion. Today it's about 7, right? So we have more than a three and a quarter fold increase in world population. So if all this stuff is true, then we should be seeing lots of bad outcomes, right? Instead, what are we seeing? So we've seen life expectancy more than double from 30 to 64 years. We've seen GDP per capita globally, this is adjusting from inflation, triple. And at the same time, when we talk about like resources, so how do you like measure scarcity of resources? Price is a pretty good proxy for that, right? And so since 1900, with sort of the most commodities, you've seen like a 1% decline on average in the price every year. So, like I'm open to the idea of like that there is some point at which too many people is too many people and creates bad outcomes, but that point is so far afield that we haven't seen it. There's no evidence of it. And so when you push these people hard, it always goes, well, but now I'm talking about the ozone hole. And well, then the ozone hole goes away. Well, now it's global warming. And so it's a moving target. It becomes difficult to get them to really kind of commit to what is it that you're so concerned about. So, right. He's coming around with the mic.
I was wondering if you could talk about changes in gender roles and how that impacts, fertility rates, and then also about basically sort of the near universalization of higher education. So young men and women basically socialize in the same manner, similar career goals, and for women, their most fertile years are also at the same time they're supposed to be investing in these really sort of intense careers in business or medicine. So not every woman can be Sheryl Sandberg. All women just can't lean in. If they did, we basically wouldn't have, we would just have fertility continue to decline. So I don't know if you could just talk about those two things. Thank you.
Sure. So the question is about gender roles and about changing gender roles, how that impacts fertility, and about education, how that impacts fertility as well. So I'll peel these apart and do them separately. So for gender roles, so the people, when I sort of grossly generalize about the left, the reason that they believe that the answer is more daycare is a bunch of studies fixated on the differences in fertility between Northern and Southern Europe. And what they see is that they're looking at labor force participation rates and fertility rates. And what they see is that in Southern Europe, like Spain, Portugal, Italy, Greece, very, very low labor participation rates of women, very low fertility rates. Up north, much, much higher labor force participation rates much higher fertility rates. And so they say, well, see, look, this, correlation, causation, bam. It turns out it's actually a little bit more complicated than that for a whole bunch of reasons. But one of the things that really is different between the North and the South in Europe, and actually I think should get a lot more attention, is what men do. Because in Northern Europe, like the men really roll up their sleeves and get involved in parenting. In Southern Europe, as a cultural thing, they don't. It would not surprise me if that has a pretty large, again, I don't want to spoil it for you guys, but there's a lot of work in parenting. Like, you know, I came home from work last week and, you know, I came upstairs, my wife was nursing the baby, my son was in timeout on the front porch, my daughter was in timeout in her room, and I went into a room and she like is sitting there on the sofa and I say, Princess, what's going on? She goes, I threw up on the carpet. You know, it's like, oh, daddy's home, great. But this is, I would say, so just empirically, so there's actually been a lot of study on using time diaries on what men and women in America, how they use their time in parenting. And what we've seen is since the 60s, both men and women have more than doubled the amount of time they spend parenting. So we spend a lot more time parenting, and even working mothers and working fathers. And so to the point where like a working mother today spends more time on the kids than a stay-at-home mom in 1965 did. And really, if you really want to like think about what that means for like how we parent, think about there's a lot less kids. So it's like, you know, a lot more time per kid because we're not having as many of them. So we're helicopter parenting and doing all sorts of things. But the key thing is here that the men are getting involved. Like, you know, dads are doing stuff, which is important. And frankly, you know, like as ambivalent as I am about kids, like I wouldn't not want to do it because I really love my wife and we're like, you know, we're in the foxhole together. It's us against them. And, you know, like I got her back and I want to, you know, get down there and do it together. I wouldn't want her doing it by herself. That'd be weird. So the other thing he said about it was education. And so he said, so the education effect is really robust, really, really robust. Again, it goes all times, all eras, all places. So in America, what's happening with that, and I'll just talk about America about this for a moment. A lot of that, I think, is, again, it's timing. You know, so you don't graduate from college till you're 22, 23. If you then maybe you go to grad school. Okay, so let's say you go to law school or medical. Let's just pick medical school. You're now 27 by the time you get out. So you do your residency, you do your internship. Like you're 31 before you've started your career, and only then can you really look around and like try to get married and then maybe have a kid. It's really hard. You know, the interesting stuff is BYU, which, you know, again, we got glimpses of earlier today. So BYU has a huge married population because it turns out that actually, just from a purely economic point of view, college is a great time to have a kid. Like you're not foregoing wages. Like you're not really doing anything else with your time. Like, you know, there's a lot of nudity, there's a lot of bodily fluids, there's a lot of cleaning up. Like it's basically the same as college, except you're taking care of little people and not big people. So out at BYU, they have some really large percentage. I think it's 10 or 15% of the student body like are marrieds with kids at any given time, and they have like separate housing for them and everything. Like, you know, like these nice little townhouses, and it's great. And I think to the extent that we are going to like change things around, it would have to be through like little changes in the culture where we make colleges. God knows, I don't want to like be in the business of telling college kids get married now. But you know, if a couple college kids do want to get married, like, you know, have there be a little bit of a framework to support that. And I think that this is something the Sheryl Sandbergs of the world don't really appreciate. So, yeah. If you just want to talk, I'll just restate the question.
All right, thank you very much for your talk. I'm actually going to buy your book like later today. This is awesome, very interesting. One point though that I wanted to ask you about, in Thomas Sowell's book, Economic Facts and Fallacies, he kind of gives a different interpretation of why family income has seemed to stagnate. His conclusion is that, well, he looks at per capita income and he says, okay, per capita income has increased drastically since 1970, his claim is. And the reason why family household income has changed is because the average amount of wage earners in a house has decreased. And for a lot of different reasons, when you have more income, you can move out and not live with the parents for a while. So I was just wondering your opinion on that and breakdown of why it seems stagnant.
Yeah, that's a big conservative fight. Like there's like in conservative world and Republican world, there's a big fight over, no, things are doing great for the middle class. They're doing great. And there are a lot of very smart economist types who tried to parse this. James Pethokoukis, the American Enterprise Institute. If you just like stop by, I'll, like, give me your card or something or email, and I'll send it to you, so you don't have to like search for it yourself. Sort of tried to referee this, a year ago, and there are a bunch of different ways to slice it. You can slice it so that it looks like income has kind of creeped up a little bit. So that's like the best, the best case scenario you could say is that middle class wages have gone up a tiny bit over the last 40 years. But by any metric, it is a much, much slower growth line than it was during the post-war years. And if you don't want to be that charitable, they look really flat. And I would say, sort of you look around, who are you going to believe, like an economist or your own line eyes? Things aren't as good for the middle class as they used to be. And this is something that I think actually Republicans need to like get over. And whatever. I mean, now I'm talking politics because I work at the Weekly Standard. But yeah, I mean, like, I think it's a bad position to be in, like just denying that things are really bad for the middle class and saying, you guys, everything's fine. There was that moment with, I guess it was help me, Treasury Secretary, the last one. No. Paulson, right? Where he was doing this was like 2010, and he was doing a press conference, and he said, everything is fine for the middle class. You look around, the new iPad costs the same as the old iPad, and it's got a better screen, and its processor is twice as fast. This one reporter goes to him, yeah, but you can't eat an iPad, So anyway, so yeah, you can parse it a bunch of different ways, and the best case scenario is that it's increased slightly, but again, you look at it relative to post-war years, and it's nothing like what it used to be.
So classical economic theory of growth predicts that the higher the fertility rate, the faster you'll grow as a country. I don't know if you've researched more, some of this is the Solid Swan theory of growth and just a lot of theories that derive from that. So I was wondering if you knew anything about, like, if you dealt with that in your research, because that is like a big motivator for like a lot of organizations like the UN and even the Obama administration that give aid to countries with the prerequisite of using contraception or methods that lower the birth rates. I was wondering if you had any economic insight on that.
Sure. So the question is about the economic benefits of low fertility rates, right? And so they're real. So if you are a developing country and you go from a very high fertility rate to a very low fertility rate very quickly, Singapore is a perfect example of this. There are lots of short-term economic benefits to it. The problem is they come with a very long-term price, and the price is that all this other stuff becomes unsustainable. And so what do you do once you find your way into that trap? And the real kicker in all of this is that you better get rich when you do it, because if you don't, then things are bad. So what do rich countries do when rich countries wind up in the sort of like the demographic recession Japan is in? Well, they have blue ribbon commissions, and they talk very earnestly about it, and they pass tax policy initiatives. It's not going to be like that in Bangladesh. Like in a poor country, like it's a matter of life and death. It's old people. China. This is what people are really worried about with China. China is getting old before they are very rich, and within I think it's 15 years, China's going to have 300 million people over the age of 65, like an entire America over the age of 65. And because of one child, almost nobody to care for them, no state pension system to speak of to take care of them. And so what does China do? I mean, this is a country that within living memory has killed 50 million of its citizens. I mean, do they step forward and take care of these people? Do they just send them off to the countryside to die? Do they wind up as a risk of revolution? I mean, we really don't know. So yeah, that's it. Short-term gains, yes, they are real. Long-term consequences, yes, they're real.
I was interested to know, you didn't bring up abortion, to my knowledge, during your talk. Would you mind either expanding on why it's not relevant to the discussion, or why it's not playing a role in the lack of fertility and so forth?
Sure. So the question is about abortion. Does abortion play any role in this? I deal with this in the book, actually. Not that you're on the hook for having read it or anything. So abortion is a little counterintuitive. Just on the face, you would say, okay, well, we're at what, 48 million abortions since Roe, or is that the number now? 40, you guys probably know better than I do. Are we at 60? Right, so you say, well, wait a minute, if all those kids have been born, then we'd be in a much different place demographically. It seems, I would say it seems reasonable to suspect that in the early post-Roe years, a great many of those abortions might have been converted to life. If you go back in time, with a time machine, and get rid of Roe, that a great number of those abortions might get converted to live births. But as the years go on, that's not as clear to me. I actually suspect that abortion becomes basically birth control of last resort. And if the abortion right goes away, then instead what happens is people don't get pregnant. They're just more careful with their birth control. There's been one really good study on this, the RAND Corporation. It's referenced in the book. You don't have to buy the book. Just, again, send me your email or something, and I'll send you the study in a PDF. And what they found is that abortion has a reasonably small effect on the fertility rate of white Americans, a larger effect, but still, like medium small on Hispanic Americans. The group where it really, really punishes them is African Americans. Really, really robust effect, drives African American fertility down. I don't have it at the tip of my tongue, and so I don't want to tell you the number, but it's really robust and measurable. And this is like one of those, just another one of those cases, as I was going through writing this book, like case after case, whether you're talking about cohabitation or divorce, out of wedlock births, abortion, like the African American community is just, crushed and punished by it. And it's really depressing and tragic. And so the answer to the question is, it's hard to say. You will occasionally see pro-lifers say, oh, well, all of those, minus Roe, all of those kids would have been born, and so we'd be in a different demographic position. I think that is probably a stretch too far to say.
With China's, I'm sure China has a knowledge of its demographics. Why do they still have a one or semi-one child policy? That doesn't make any sense. Which, I guess one child policy doesn't really make sense. But with the knowledge that such a high amount of their population will be over the age of 65 very soon, why don't they do anything to change their? I know it's kind of speculation, but.
No, it's not. That's a great question, actually, and I have a good answer for it, believe it or not. So the question is, why is China persisting in this one-child policy, despite the fact that they have like doom bearing down on them, right? And the answer is complicated. So, like the demographers in China, to the extent that they can speak freely, which is difficult, right? They have been trying to quietly sound the alarm for like 15 years now. And they've been agitating within the government, roll it back, roll it back, roll it back. And so, like among the people who study this stuff, there's all sorts of like Kremlinology and tea leaf reading on, well, okay, so like last year, they took the division which is in charge of enforcement, and they rolled it into a different division. And so, like, everybody who studies this is like, oh my God, they're going to get rid of one child. This means the other change was just a bureaucratic change, as it turns out. So eventually we think they will do away with it, but the question is what comes next? The scariest thing for China is looking at ideal fertility in China. We talked about ideal fertility here. There has been one really, really good survey on ideal fertility in China, and it was just on this one province, and it was a province where one child has been like a quarter way rolled back, and women can have 2 kids pretty easily. And what they found is that ideal fertility there is at about 1.5. So the question then becomes, ideal fertility really is a ceiling for you. Your actual fertility rate doesn't go above ideal. And once your ideal is below replacement, you're really screwed. Then your future is pretty much written in stone for the foreseeable future then.
You mentioned that part of, I guess, that people are spending double the amount of time with their children with parenting as they used to in the 1960s. Why is that happening, and do you think that's leading people to have fewer children?
Maybe. Yeah,
why are we saying we have less time, so why are we spending more?
Yeah, so the question is, if people are spending all this extra time with their kids, why are they doing it? And is that causing us to have fewer kids? And I think, yeah, actually. This is, I don't have data on this. But just sort of, if you think about it, noodle it over. So what are we doing? Like, we're obsessed with like, molding our kids into these perfect little creatures. And so we have them in like, karate class where they're also learning calligraphy. Like I did, like, kidding. So like where we used to live, I saw a flyer up at the coffee shop for this karate school. And the flyer was like, Master Wu is a 5-time whatever champion and went to an Ivy League school, and all of our instructors have master's degrees. Like, what kind of parent cares about the graduate education of the karate instructor for their 5-year-old, right? I mean, this is crazy. But like, this is what we do with our kids now, right? I mean, they call it helicopter parenting if you read the mommy blogs, and everybody looks down on it, and I do too, and I'm sure I do it. As I'm like out watching Cody. No, Cody, ride your bike. No, don't. It's too. You're gonna crash. You're gonna die. But this is like what parents do now. So you're spending all this extra time. And anyways, this economist down at George Mason, Brian Kaplan, makes the case that so what we've done is we have talked ourselves into spending more time on kids than we really need to, and that this is part of what then when we think about having another kid, we think, well, God, where am I gonna have the time? I'm already stretched so thin. Whereas back in back in the Levittown days, June Cleaver would be like, hey, head out to play. Like, that was parenting. You know what, all those kids turned out okay. Like, they didn't die, everything was all right. But I would say it's hard to do. Like, I myself, I try to do that too. Like, I try to do that with my kids. And then, after 3 minutes, I'm like looking out the window, to make sure the axe murderer hasn't come to our suburban cul-de-sac or something. Yeah. So it's hard, and yes, you're right. And on the other hand, should you ever find yourself in an unfortunate way the way we have, it's tough to do the free range parenting thing.
What potential do you think there is for high fertility subgroups to eventually reverse this trend? That's very, very long term.
So the question is, what in the long term, high fertility subgroups, how do they change everything? And the answer is, I'm 100% certain that the people who have babies will inherit the earth. So is my buddy demographer, Nick Eberstadt. His wife was here on campus on Friday, I think. Did any of you see her, Mary Eberstadt, when she was here? So Nick Eberstadt says, what we're not talking about is an extinction event. It's not like people are going to go away, because even in Singapore, where the fertility rate is 1.1, there are subgroups of people who are having kids, and over the course of time, those people inherit the earth. And so everything winds up fine in the long term. That's why I'd say my concerns here aren't the long term. My concerns are the medium term. How do we get from here to there? And the process of going from here to there, as we shed some people and we get all these stresses, this is a nice little Western civilization we've built up here, and I'd like to keep it. And if you put all these stresses on it as you're in the process of getting to the long term where everything is okay, maybe it survives, maybe it doesn't. I don't really know. I hope it does. I assume it will. But we got to worry about it. But yeah, and there's a great book on this guy named Eric Kaufman with a K. It's called Shall the Religious Inherit the Earth? And what he did, it's like the fourth time I've done it. I'm going to do math in front of you. So he looks at basically 3 bits of calculus, 3 bits of dx/dt, and he's looking at the fertility difference between practitioners and non-practitioners. He's looking at the pass-on rate of religion from parents to kids, and then the attrition rate of grown-ups falling away from faith. And what he says, when you run these numbers with the data we have right now, we may be at the high water mark of secularism, because it turns out that even though the people who don't believe stuff really aren't having kids, the people who go to church once a week, and church meaning any church, any denomination, they're having 2.5 kids on average each. They pass on religion at a very, very robust rate, and their attrition rate is actually pretty low. And so when you sort of do all this math over the course of the next 2.5 generations or so, we could wind up with a much more religiously orthodox country. And if all that works out, maybe the overall fertility rate changes actually shift upward a little sooner than we would expect. And Eric, I would say, Eric's a very smart guy, but he's a secular lefty, and this scares the crap out of him. So he's not doing wish fulfillment here. I'm sorry, you're all the way up here, and now don't let me drive. It's a bad idea.
So you mentioned previously that there are a lot of campaigns put out by the government to produce fertility or encourage fertility. Could you explain a little bit more about why those campaigns aren't working?
The question is, why don't pronatalist policies work? And I don't know is the answer. So, I mean, I can tell you what the literature says, because there's been a lot of like epidemiology about this very specific question. And what it suggests is that for every, whether you're doing the liberal stuff or the conservative stuff, every 25% increase in government spending gives you a 0.4% increase in fertility rate over the short term. And that bumps all the way up to, I think, a 4% increase in the long term, meaning after 20 years. There are individual success stories. Estonia had a pretty good result. Montreal had a pretty good result with short-term programs. But the body of evidence suggests that just, when you're trying to get people to have kids, it's very, very hard to do it. And I mean, my armchair philosophy, and this is just me, shooting from the hip, I don't actually have any numbers on this, is that the reason is because people aren't stupid, right? I mean, if you don't want kids, like getting even a $9,000 check from the Singapore government, like if you don't want kids and you know what that all looks like, you don't want to see that movie, $9,000 is not enough to make you do that. Maybe $1 million might be, And so that's why I think the key in all of this isn't, just because all this pronatalist policy has failed does not mean it is all doomed to fail. And so what I suggest in the book, when I talk to people is, as my old basketball coach used to tell me, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take. So it's, we got to keep trying something, but we ought to be rigorous in trying to evaluate it. We ought to try not to be ideologically blinkered about it. And the framework that I think would probably be most fruitful would be not trying to like bribe people into having kids, but look into places where we have created sort of artificial obstructions to the people who already want kids and try to flatten those out. And so like the Mike Lee proposal, what he looks at doing is he looks at cutting FICA taxes, cutting payroll taxes for people with kids. The reason he does that is because there's a bunch of research on what Social Security does to fertility rate. It suggests that Social Security just itself depresses fertility rate by about 0.5 kids in America right now. And so what he's saying is, okay, so we've created this artificial disincentive with Social Security. Let's try to flatten that out a little bit. And I guess, like if I thought about this for another week or two, like I could be marginally convinced that we ought to try this. And, it doesn't mean we stay hidebound to it, but it's worth experimenting and, and hoping that at some point somebody hits upon a solution that works. And if not, then, we're all doomed. Anyway, are we okay on time? Or?
We have just a couple more minutes.
Oh.
There's one more question.
Is there one more question?
So in your book, you give an example of one country where what they tried did work. It's one of the Eastern European countries with the patriarch and everything. I was hoping you could speak a little bit more about that.
Thank you for bringing that up. So the question is, there is an exception that proves the rule. I talk about this in the book. And the exception is Georgia, the country, not the Atlanta Falcons people. So in Georgia, their fertility crashed following the fall of the Berlin Wall, and really low. No country has ever touched what we call lowest low fertility, which is 1.4 and below, and then recovered, except for Georgia. Georgia is the exception that proves the rule. And because when they hit lowest low fertility, Georgia's a very, very orthodox country religiously. Like here, much higher rates of orthodoxy and church attendance among the young even than of the old. And so the patriarch, Ilya II, he comes out and he says, well, I'm going to personally baptize every third born kid. And the next year, births go up by 20%. And the year after that, 20%. And they're right up at replacement now. And so he does this like once a month, these mass baptisms, where he comes out to like whatever the Georgian equivalent of St. Peter's Square is. Like he comes out and, baptizes like 10,000 babies. And the people, they love it because it's really important to them. They're Orthodox believers. And this is, it sort of gets at what we were just talking about a minute ago. Like the religious belief is really, really powerful. It's the single most powerful predictor of fertility outcomes. Like if you can only know one thing about a person to predict how many babies they're going to have over the course of their lifetime, what you want to know is church attendance. And for people who are religiously orthodox and they go to church once a week or more, very, very high robust fertility rates, very high ideal fertility rates too. And that, I think, that speaks to something deeply powerful about why it is that people really do have kids. And I will condense this to like literally 90 seconds. If you just think grossly about what is different between the religious view of the world and the irreligious view of the world, I would argue that it's a temporal difference, right? If you do not have religion in your life, whatever it is, you view the world through the lens of the now, right? Like everything is now. If you believe in God, the chief difference of deism is that all of a sudden the now gets complemented by two other things. It gets complemented by a view of the past to which you have some duty, and a view of the future about which you have some hope. And that those other two worldviews are really what you need to get over the hump of having the kids. Because if all you're ever focused on is the now, it becomes very, very hard to convince yourself why a kid is worth it. And to really understand, and for all my show about how tough kids are, in the bigger worldview, they are important, and we do have duties to the past and hope for the future, and that's why eventually some of us are stupid enough to have them. So anyway, thanks a lot, and I guess we'll go to dinner.